Imagine this. You're walking the streets of ancient Rome and witness something chilling. The Emperor Nero himself is strolling through the forum with what appears to be his new wife, a striking young woman clad in silky jewels. But whispers follow them, because everyone knows the horrific truth. That woman, at the side of the world's most powerful man, was once a boy named Sporus, and what Nero did to her represents one of the most disturbing acts of psychological and physical abuse on record. Before delving into these forgotten tales of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about history's hidden truths, consider hitting the like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please leave a comment below to let me know where you're listening from. It's incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connecting time and space with our shared curiosity about the past. What you're about to hear isn't just another tale of Roman excess. It's the story of how absolute power can transform love into an obsession, grief into madness, and a human being into a living doll created to serve one man's twisted fantasy. The name Sporus may not sound familiar to you, but his story will haunt you long after you've finished listening. Let's begin with Nero, the man who would become the architect of this tragedy. Nero wasn't born evil. In fact, the early stages of his reign were promising. When he ascended to the throne at just 16, many Romans believed they were witnessing the dawn of a golden age. He reduced taxes, financed public entertainment, and even performed in theatrical performances that delighted the common people. But absolute power has a way of corrupting even the most promising souls. And by the time of Messalina, something fundamental had broken in the emperor's mind. Perhaps it was the constant paranoia that came from knowing everyone around him wanted his position. Perhaps it was the isolation that came with being the only one in an empire of 60 million who could never face conflict, who could never be challenged, who could never be said to be wrong. Or perhaps it was what happened to the one person he claimed to love more than life itself. Her name was Poppaea Sabina, and she was everything Nero thought he wanted in a woman. Indescribably beautiful, intelligent enough to match his grandiose vision, and ambitious enough to share his dreams of eternal glory. But Poppaea wasn't just a pretty face in the imperial court. He possessed keen political instincts, making him a formidable ally or a dangerous enemy. When Nero first saw Poppaea, he was already married to Octavia, the daughter of the previous emperor. This was a cold, loveless, and political marriage. Poppaea represented everything Octavia was not. Octavia was quiet and reserved, while Poppaea was lively and imperious. While Poppaea tried to avoid attention, Poppaea relished being the center of attention. The relationship between Nero and Poppaea began as a typical Roman scandal. However, what began as adultery soon turned into something far more dangerous: a true obsession. Nero was not merely attracted to Poppaea's beauty. His passion for her consumed him, horrifying even his closest advisors. Ancient historians describe Nero's behavior during this period as increasingly erratic and possessive. He would fly into fits of homicidal rage when other men even looked at Poppaea for too long during public events. Under the pretext of protecting her, he began stationing guards around her at all times, actually monitoring her every interaction. He lavished her with gifts that depleted the imperial treasury: jewels from India, silks from China, perfumes from Arabia. But perhaps most noticeably, he began reshaping reality to accommodate his obsession. He first divorced Octavia, a shocking move that alienated many of his supporters. Then he announced his intention to marry Poppaea in a full-blown imperial ceremony. The wedding was an unprecedented display of luxury in which Nero spared no expense to demonstrate his devotion. Even marriage failed to satisfy Nero's need for complete possession of Poppaea. He began isolating her from her family and friends. He surrounded her with people who owed their positions entirely to his favor. He commissioned dozens of portraits of her, not only for public display, but also for his private rooms.
This way, he could gaze at her even when they were apart.
Ancient sources describe Nero sometimes spending hours simply watching Poppaea as she went about her daily activities. This wasn't a romantic attachment. It was the behavior of someone who confused love with possessiveness, viewing another person not as an independent person, but as a beautiful object existing solely for his own pleasure. She was intelligent enough to understand that her beauty and Nero's obsession gave her unprecedented power. But she was also shrewd enough to realize that this power came with great risks. She began using her influence to advance her family's interests. She built a network of supporters who would protect her whenever Nero's affection wavered. However, Poppaea had a fatal flaw. She was not afraid to stand up to Nero. Unlike everyone else in the imperial court, Poppaea had learned to predict the emperor's moods. Yet she maintained the independence of her spirit. She would argue with him about his political decisions, criticize his artistic pursuits, and even mock his performances when she thought they were poor. For example, the details of what happened on that fateful day in 65 AD vary depending on which ancient historian you believe. But the outcome was always the same. During a typical domestic argument, which began about Nero's late arrival from the horse races or his fondness for theatrical art, the emperor lost control in a way that would haunt him forever. According to Tacitus, the argument escalated when Poppaea dared to criticize Nero's priorities, suggesting that he cared more about his public image than his responsibilities as a husband and father. She was pregnant with their second child at the time, and perhaps the stress made her less tolerant of Nero's increasingly erratic behavior. What happened next has been debated by historians for centuries. However, there is a consensus. In a fit of rage, Nero allegedly kicked or struck his pregnant wife so violently that she suffered fatal internal injuries. Some sources claim a single blow to the abdomen. Others describe a sustained assault that left him bleeding and unconscious on the marble floor. Imagine the moment Nero realized what he had done. The man who commanded 30 legions, who could execute anyone with a single word, who was worshipped as a god in the eastern provinces, had destroyed the only thing he truly cared about with his own uncontrolled violence. The woman he was obsessed with was dying because of him. Ancient sources describe the scene that followed as one of the most pitiful moments in the history of the empire. Nero reportedly threw himself over Poppaea's body, begging her forgiveness, while simultaneously ordering her to live, as if imperial authority extended even beyond death. He summoned the best Roman physicians. He offered them fortunes to save her life. He threatened to torture them if they failed. But it was too late. Poppaea died within hours, taking with her the unborn child who could have been Nero's heir. At that moment, something fundamental snapped in the emperor's mind.
The grief that followed wasn't just emotional devastation, it was a complete break with reality. Nero's mourning became legendary. He refused to have Poppaea's body cremated, as was Roman custom. Instead, he ordered her embalmed and placed in a more elaborate tomb than that of previous emperors. He declared her holy, established a cult in her honor, and spoke to her corpse for days as if she could still hear him. The imperial court now had to operate in an even more dangerous environment. Courtiers were expected to subscribe to the fiction that Poppaea was somehow still alive, to speak of him in the present tense, and to leave his favorite seat empty at banquets. Anyone who suggested that the emperor should advance was immediately exiled or worse. It was during this period that Sporus entered Nero's field of vision, unaware that he was walking into a nightmare. Sporus was probably 14 or 15 years old. He had been born a slave in the imperial household and freed as a child. He had been raised within the palace walls, receiving an education that prepared him for administrative duties. This was, in fact, a position of relative privilege. Those in the imperial service generally enjoyed better conditions than free-born citizens of the lower classes. However, this privilege came with complete dependence on imperial favor. The freedmen owed everything to the generosity of their former masters, which created absolute defenselessness. They could have risen to great influence, but without legal recourse, they could have been quickly dismissed, punished, or killed. What made Sporus special in Nero's eyes wasn't his intelligence or skills. It was his face. Multiple ancient sources agree that the young man bore an uncanny resemblance to the dead Poppaea, particularly his eyes and delicate bone structure. In a world where the Romans believed that physical resemblance indicated a deeper spiritual connection, this resemblance, of course, presented an obvious problem. Sporus was male, but for a man who believed himself a god and spent months conversing with a corpse, changing someone's sex seemed like a minor obstacle. What happened next represents one of the most calculated acts of cruelty in human history. Nero didn't just decide to force Sporus to dress as a woman, he decided to make the transformation permanent. The emperor summoned the best physicians in Rome and ordered them to perform surgery on the young man, simply to make him appear more feminine. This wasn't just mutilation, it was the systematic destruction of Sporus's identity as a human being. The procedure was dangerous, painful, and irreversible. It usually resulted in death from infection or blood loss, but even if Sporus survived, he would be forever changed, physically, emotionally, and socially. He would never be able to have children, enjoy normal relationships, or even be accepted as a full man in Roman society.
The surgery was performed in the imperial palace, in rooms specifically prepared for this purpose. Ancient surgical procedures relied on rudimentary instruments and crude anesthetics. The process must have been hours of torture and carried a significant risk of death. Sporus must have been restrained by guards as the physicians approached with their instruments. Knowing her cries would fall on deaf ears, after Sporus had recovered, a process that lasted weeks or months, Nero announced something that shocked even the shrewd Roman aristocrats. She would marry the young man in a full-blown imperial wedding ceremony. The preparations took months and consumed enormous resources. Sporus was given a new name, Sabina, after the dead empress, and moved to private chambers where she could prepare for her new role. Imperial tailors created a complete wardrobe, designing dresses to fit her altered physique and conceal her remaining male features. Master jewelers crafted ornaments specifically for her, many of which contained precious stones that had once belonged to Poppaea. These were not merely accessories, they were tangible links to the dead woman. They were physical reminders of the person Sporus had been forced to impersonate. Makeup artists taught her cosmetic techniques to feminize her features. They showed her how to use charcoal to make her eyes look larger, how to apply blush for rosy cheeks, how to use powder to soften her features. These lessons weren't just about appearance. They were exercises in the systematic erasure of her original identity. Hairdressers taught her the elaborate hairdressing techniques fashionable among aristocratic Roman women. Her hair was cut, curled, and arranged in intricate patterns. It often included expensive ornaments. This process could take hours daily, requiring multiple servants and heated metal tools. But perhaps the most psychologically damaging were the lessons in feminine behavior and posture. Sporus was assigned teachers who taught him to walk, sit, and gesture appropriately like a lady. He learned how to hold his hands, position his feet, arrange his clothes when seated, and move in a way that conveyed grace rather than masculine strength. Voice coaches worked with him to modify his speech patterns. They taught him to speak in higher tones and adopt linguistic gestures associated with feminine speech. This was perhaps the most challenging aspect, as vocal patterns are deeply ingrained and difficult to consciously change. Can you imagine the psychological torture of this transformation? Every day, Sporus was forced to look into mirrors reflecting a stranger in his face. Every lesson in feminine behavior reminded him that his identity was being systematically erased. Every piece of jewelry that once adorned a dead woman was a fetter,
binding her to a role she had never chosen. The wedding was planned for 67 AD, coinciding with religious festivals that would add ceremonial weight. Nero spared no expense. He treated the wedding as a legitimate imperial wedding, worthy of the greatest emperor in Roman history. The ceremony took place in the largest palace hall, decorated with imported flowers and lit by thousands of oil lamps. Musicians played traditional wedding songs, while servants served the finest wines and delicacies. To outsiders, unfamiliar with the full story, it might have appeared like a normal imperial wedding. But those inside realized they had witnessed something unprecedented and disturbing. Here was the world's most powerful man publicly marrying a young boy surgically altered to look like his dead wife. The ceremony included all the traditional Roman rituals: the exchange of vows, the handshake, the sharing of the sacred bread, the signing of the legal documents that formalized this union. The guests played their roles masterfully, offering congratulations and expensive gifts while maintaining the appropriate cheerfulness. But the atmosphere must have been filled with the barely concealed terror, fascination, and nervous energy that comes from participating in something fundamentally wrong. After the wedding, Nero treated Sporus as a legitimate empress. The young man was given his own rooms within the palace complex, and income from the imperial treasury. He had his own throne for travel, horses for riding, and a retinue of supporters. But all this apparent luxury came at a terrible price: the complete erasure of his original identity and the constant performance of a psychologically destructive role. Sporus was expected to accompany Nero to public functions, sit by his side at state dinners, and play the role of faithful wife in all interactions. This wasn't just about appearances. Nero seemed genuinely convinced that he had successfully resurrected Poppaea. He would address Sporus by his dead wife's name, recalling shared memories that had never occurred, and expecting responses that perpetuated this elaborate fiction. For Sporus, every day became a high-stakes performance in which the slightest mistake could lead to death. He had to remember not only to look and act like a woman, but also to react as if Poppaea were herself. When Nero recounted events from his previous marriage, Sporus had to react as if he personally remembered them.
Ancient sources describe Sporus becoming increasingly skilled at this deception, developing an almost supernatural ability to predict Nero's moods and respond appropriately. But they also note that, despite his public role as a believer, he became increasingly withdrawn and melancholic as time went on. The psychological tension is almost impossible to imagine. Every morning, Sporus awoke in rooms decorated to evoke a dead woman he had never met. Every reflection in the mirror resembled nothing so much as her original appearance. Every conversation required pretending to be someone else, inhabiting moments and experiences that were not his own. For over 2 years, Sporus lived this strange existence, but his suffering reached new heights when Nero decided to travel to Greece. The emperor considered himself an artist and was eager to compete in Greek festivals, where he believed his talents would be properly recognized. Naturally, Sporus accompanied him and was presented to foreign dignitaries as the Roman empress. Imagine the Greek aristocracy struggling to understand why their conquerors would demand that a young boy travel dressed as a woman, and that everyone accept this apparent fiction as fact. But by 668 AD, Nero's excesses had finally put too much strain on Roman order. Fed up with the emperor's erratic behavior and negligence in governing, rebellions broke out across the empire, led by the governors. The Praetorian Guard declared their opposition to Nero's continued rule, and the Senate condemned him as an enemy of the state. When Nero finally fled Rome with a small group of supporters, Sporus was at odds with him. Despite facing death, the emperor could not leave behind the living reminder of Poppaea. They waited in a villa outside Rome for either rescue or capture.
Meanwhile, Nero vacillated between grandiose escape plans and theatrical preparations for suicide. When news of the enemy's approach arrived, Nero ultimately chose death over capture. However, his suicide left Sporus incredibly vulnerable, one of the most visible symbols of Nero's reign. He was both a valuable prize and a dangerous liability for the next power holder. What followed was perhaps even more tragic. Sporus became a political pawn, passed from one powerful man to another like a valuable commodity. He was captured first by Nymphidius Sabinus and then by Otho Vitellius. Each treated him as Nero had done, dressing him like a woman and calling him by Poppaea's name. It was under Vitellius that Sporus's nightmare reached its final conclusion. The new emperor decided to use him for public entertainment in the Colosseum, particularly in reenactments of mythological scenes involving violence and humiliation. For Sporus, this meant the ultimate degradation: sexual humiliation in front of thousands for entertainment. Rather than succumb to this final humiliation, Sporus made the only choice that had truly been his for years. He committed suicide, probably by poison, in 69 AD.
He was probably no more than 20 years old. In death, Sporus finally escaped the grotesque theater that had consumed his life. His story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of absolute power and the human cost of imperial excess. But ancient historians found Sporus less compelling as a person than as a symbol of imperial decline. What makes his story so disturbing is not only the abuse he endured, but also how his identity and will were systematically stripped from him. From the moment Nero decided he resembled Poppaea, Sporus ceased to exist as an individual and became instead a canvas for the emperor's distorted fantasies. Sporus's choice of death over further humiliation suggests that beneath the layers of compulsory femininity and imperial conditioning, a spark of his original self survived. His suicide was both a tragedy and an act of ultimate defiance. No matter the cost of his life, he refused to be degraded any further. Perhaps most tragically, we know almost nothing about who Sporus was before his transformation. What were his hopes and dreams? What did he want to do with his life? All of these were erased when he became Nero's living baby. In its place was a performance in which his original identity was completely lost. A young man forced to become the emperor's son, enduring years of psychological and physical abuse, ultimately choosing death over further humiliation. His story deserves to be remembered not just as a curiosity from ancient Rome, but as a testament to both human cruelty and human resilience. By choosing his own death, Sporus regained the one thing that had been taken from him throughout his adult life: the power to make his own choices about his own destiny. His story reminds us that behind every historical narrative of imperial grandeur, even across a 2,000-year-wide chasm, lie individual stories of human suffering and survival that deserve our attention and compassion.